Everyone, I'm Erin Benham, the chair of the Legislation Policy Development Committee, calling our special meeting to order. On our agenda is our legislation proposals that Laura Stefan will bring us up to date for discussion. Thank you, Laura.
Great. Good morning, everyone. So for the record, again, Laura Stefan. I am the Chief of Staff and Legislative Liaison for the State Department of Education, and I am here today to present to you the 9 legislative proposals that we are putting forth for your consideration. So for those of you who are new to the committee, what I will do is I've sent you all of the proposals in advance. I hope that you did have a chance to look them over. I'm going to go over them one by one. We'll pause in between each bill so you can ask any questions that you might have. I will be upfront. I'm the first person to admit that I am not a subject matter expert on all things education. So I am going to do the best I can to answer any questions that you have. And thankfully, I have Jessa here to help me through the way. But I'm going to take notes. And if there's any questions that I cannot answer, I will get those answers for you prior to the regular December board meeting, at which I will be presenting whichever proposals you approve at this meeting today. So Erin, if you're okay proceeding that way, I will just get started going through the bills. Okay, great. So I hope I had numbered them. I don't know if you noticed in the file names, but I had numbered them. So hopefully they're in the same order for you all as they are for me, but I'll go slow. And if I'm going too fast, please let me know. The first proposal is an act concerning the age when a special education student shall begin receiving transition services. This may be familiar to some of you. A few years ago, there was legislation that passed that required transition services to happen at age 14 rather than at age 16 for only students with autism. So when that happened, many special education directors began considering transition services for all students instead of only those students in that specific subgroup. So this proposal would bring statute into line with what we believe is pretty much current practice. We do feel that all students can, with an IEP, can benefit from having transition services at an earlier age. And if you approve this and it makes its way through the General Assembly, we will be, I believe, one of 29 states that offers transition services to students at a younger age than 16. And I will stop there for any questions.
And Laura, you're very correct that this is a common practice in many districts already. When special ed students are transitioned, it is not simply something that we don't do or didn't do until the child was 16. We transition students from special schools into regular public schools. Typically, big transition year is 6th to 7th grade or into a middle school setting. So this is something that is done by many school district staffs already, and important to do so. We have a lot of special needs children that need that transition services much earlier than 16 years old. So questions from the committee? Malia?
Yeah, so not being somebody that works in education or in a school, and can you describe for me just what is meant by transition services? What does that look like?
Sure. So I actually asked Brian Klemkowitz that exact same question, so I have the answer. Transition services at age 14 would involve tapping into the student's areas of interest and would result in assessments within the school, coordination and alignment with student success planning, and result in goals and objectives within a student's IEP.
Malia, very often as a classroom teacher, I would attend transition IEP meetings from students coming into my middle school because I was the head of the language arts department. We would typically meet with their past caseworker, their new caseworker that would be assigned to the school coming in, and discuss things like Laura had said, things that maybe will help the child transition better, clubs that we'd want them to be exposed to, just real simple things that your typical student might know, but your special ed or special needs child would need some help with. Parents would also be included, so it would also be a very sort of welcoming time for parents who are very nervous sending their child to a middle school.
Can I ask a follow-on question?
Yep, go ahead.
What was the specialness of, what's the specialness of the age, right? What's the specialness of 16 versus 14? What's happening at that time and those times that those were selected?
I don't really know. I never understood 16, quite frankly. 16 could be a junior in high school. So I never understood that. All I do know is, like Laura had mentioned, is that many districts, and Don probably could chime in too, many districts did these transitions at earlier ages. I'm not sure why.
I guess I misunderstood this. I thought this was about preparing the child for transition post K-12. Maybe I misunderstood that. I thought that's what the transition we were talking about was.
Well, I think probably the term transition could be, be used in both cases, but I think that's spot on, Karen, that part of the term of art here is not just the types of transitions you're talking about, Erin, but really the transition out of the LEA. So the federal law used to be 14. It used to be, and so it's talking about planning. So it's not that the transition will necessarily happen at those ages. It's that the planning starts for that transition. So in this case, it used to be that the federal law was 14. I think around 2005, it changed to 16. And then there was a push in Connecticut to change it back to 14 for certain populations. So as Laura said, this is bringing it all in line. But again, the concept being that for some of these students, it may be that there is an actual transition pending, but typically it's planning for a future transition. And, I know I've spoken to Brian about it a little bit as well. And, the feeling is certainly planning earlier, benefits the student, even if the actual activities may not happen until they're closer to their junior or senior year, or whenever it is that they may exit services from the LEA.
And also, what are they transitioning to? To another facility or another program? Because you refer to 16, 17-year-olds as sophomores or juniors, but the fact of the matter is they may not be in that position. So just because somebody has reached the age of 18 to be able to graduate, that may not be the case for many special ed students. So you're going to transition them to another program to continue their education.
Woody, some of them were actually even looking into group homes, that type of thing. A workforce program, those things. But this law, right, Laura, specifically just was for one disability, though, right?
As it was originally passed in 2019 at this point, they had carved out the 14 only for students that were labeled autistic.
Right. And that, I think, is what red flagged a lot of our special ed folks in Connecticut, is why just autistic? That really, I can understand the need for autistic, but it doesn't make any sense just to flag an autistic child. Any other questions from the committee? Laura, do you want to approve these one by one, or would you rather do all of them?
I defer to however you want to do it. Typically in the past, we've gone through all of them, and then at the end, you've done one vote. Okay. So if you want, I think that's the easiest way to do it.
Yeah, I think so too.
I agree.
Okay, great. All right, so the next set of proposals, because it includes more than one in this proposal, is from our Bureau of Educator Standards and Certification, our talent office. And this is entitled an act concerning minor revisions to the bilingual education certification statutes. So this one is by far the most complicated, I think, of the proposals, or nuanced of the proposals. And so I'm going to go through the three separate sections, and I'm going to actually pause, I think, in between the sections to take questions. I think that's probably going to be the easiest way to get through it. So like I said, the proposal makes 3 changes. First, it changes the way that written competency is measured for both English and the other language when it comes to the bilingual education certificate. So currently, English competency is measured by the successful passage of an essential skills test approved by the state board. So what this proposal would allow for is the substitution of a degree earned at a college or university where the language of instruction is English, in the place of taking and passing the essential skills test. So if you were a native Spanish speaker, but you graduated from the University of Connecticut, you would be able to use that because you have clearly demonstrated mastery in English by graduating from a English speaking university. So that's what this proposal, and vice versa, for allowing for the same substitution for the other language, say if you went to a predominantly Spanish speaking institution. So that's the first part of the proposal.
Questions? Leah?
My question is actually to my fellow members here that are teachers in particularly. Does this raise any concerns for you when you read it?
No, not really. I think we can understand why this is being put in because of the desperate need of bilingual teachers. And we're not getting beyond that. I think maybe some board members remember after the devastating hurricane hit Puerto Rico, and the department was really trying, everybody in the whole, quite frankly, the whole United States was trying to reach out to those teachers to come and teach because they were certified teachers in Puerto Rico. And a lot of our certification rules and laws and regulations, including Connecticut's, we had to bend some of those in order to make that happen. So I think at this point, anything we can do, I don't think it's in any way dumbing down the certification, in my opinion. I think it's a desperate need for the state is what I think.
I hate that word. I hate that word of dumbing down something. But,
I do too.
But this is more of a relaxing of standards that don't need to be in place anyway. You think of somebody coming from Puerto Rico who is a certified teacher not being able to teach in Connecticut because of our standards. It's absolutely crazy. So I just see this as a kind of a revision or relaxing of standards. So to make it better for all kids.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. I hate that term as well, but that's what our complaint is. We're going to hear that. If we hear complaints, that's what we will hear, that's what we're doing. I don't agree that's what we're doing. I agree with you that maybe this is like a step in getting these standards completely changed.
So in part, it seemed this was saying that if you're coming from a place where you had already complete your education in the other language, that you also wouldn't have to demonstrate competency in that language here, right? So if you came from a Spanish-speaking university in Puerto Rico, you wouldn't have to come here and then demonstrate that you could speak Spanish and teach in Spanish, I believe is part of what I took away from this, which certainly doesn't seem to in any way be a dumbing down of a standard. There are multiple ways to demonstrate competency, and certainly if you achieved your degree in another language, you should be competent to be able to be deemed certified in that language here. Am I correct in that, Reed?
That's exactly right.
Yep.
I mean,
I was very comfortable. I was very comfortable with this one.
Yep.
We have to keep in mind that in the state of Connecticut, we have some of the most strict certification laws in the entire country. So we've made a very concerted effort. This is my 7th session with the department, and we've been chipping away a little by little to try and bring our standards down to a more reasonable, I believe, level that doesn't preclude or keep people out that are qualified to serve as teachers in Connecticut.
Good for you. In some
But-
cases, you need to bring a
The
book.
teacher from Puerto Rico would have to have studied at an English-speaking university to avoid taking the test.
To avoid taking the English competency test, right?
The English test, yes.
Yes,
So-
that's correct.
So this is Bonnie. One of the questions I guess that I would have is you talk about standards and the fact that we've got really rigorous certification. Can I just ask for a little background on how we got to the point where we're one of the most rigorously certified states?
I mean, again,
Just
my
because
history with my history with the department only goes back to 2015. And at that point in time, when I got here, there were already 144 pages of certification regulations that are not in line anymore with state statute. They were passed over many years. And I think that there were different people in the department at different times and in the legislature that thought that we needed to be held to a higher standard than other states. And so in the past several years, we have made many efforts to relax some of those strict rules. At one point in time, our cut scores for the praxis exam were higher than any other in New England. So we have gone down to the multi-state cut score. We removed Praxis 1 as a barrier to get into education preparation programs, and now it's used as a diagnostic tool for remediation. We've made it easier for teachers to come into Connecticut and get certified here if they've been certified in other states. So that's what I mean by saying we're slowly chipping away.
Keep going.
Thank you. I really appreciate the discussion. I just wanted to make sure that I felt like having a discussion, given the fact that it could come across as being the less favored, dumbing down sort of piece, that I really felt like for all of us to be able to hear from those that know more than I would be important. So thank you.
I think this I think will also be a step in the direction of, we're doing a lot of work with paraprofessionals and trying to get them, especially our paraprofessionals that are bilingual paraprofessionals, trying to get them into the teaching force. This will help them sort of have a relief to another roadblock too, which is important. It's very important because they could be some of our best. We just got to get them in. So, Lori, you want to go to the next piece?
I do. Yes, thank you. So the second part of this proposal, it clarifies or reclassifies in a way the grade spans that the elementary bilingual education certification will be valid for. Right now, it is currently a straight K-8 endorsement. So what this is going to allow is for a K-9 elementary and then a 4-9 middle. And so I don't know if everyone had a chance to read the background proposal, but the background for the proposal, but for anybody who didn't and for anyone who's subsequently watching this, I think it's important. I'd just like to read a small paragraph for the justification for this section. And it says that English learners may come to our classrooms from areas of strife or poverty, resulting in limited or interrupted access to academic instruction. Some of these students placed in age-appropriate grades may need elementary level instruction to catch up to their peers. Authorizing elementary bilingual educators to serve students in grades K through 9 and middle grade bilingual teachers in grades 4 through 9 improves district flexibility to create multi-age groups that better serve the academic needs of these students. Over 92% of students in mandated bilingual education programs are in grades K through 9. So I think that helps to justify the addition of the extra 9th grade year.
Yep. Questions? This one makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Just a lot of sense. Okay, can we move on to the next one?
All right, so the last part of this proposal, and this might be the more complicated one to explain, but I'm going to do my best. So this is, it creates 2 new secondary bilingual endorsements. The first is for STEM and the second is for humanities. So it's kind of going along with the new buckets that we've created for our high school graduation requirements under 10-221A a few years ago. So what this is going to do currently, eligibility for secondary bilingual certification requires coursework for a specific area, as well as coursework and testing for bilingual, which is expensive and time consuming. So in an effort to further address the severe shortage areas for bilingual, this will reduce the number of credits that are actually required. So I think the easiest way to do this one is to look at the actual proposal, the language proposal. So if you hadn't had a chance to look at it, and if you have it in front of you, you could flip a few pages forward, and all of the new language pertaining to this part of it is in subsection E. And what it's doing, the clearest way that I can explain it is this is going to be the same for STEM and same for humanities, but I'll just use humanities as the example. So what this is going to do is allow certified bilingual educators, so they're already certified bilingual educators, completing 15 hours of credit in combined content coursework in humanities to teach humanities in a bilingual program. So that's one bucket. The second is for just certified educators who are not certified bilingual educators. So this will allow certified educators that have completed 15 semester hours of credit in combined content coursework in humanities and the required coursework and testing for bilingual, because they're not certified in bilingual, to teach secondary humanities in the bilingual program. And so I used humanities as the example, but this would be the same for STEM as it would be for humanities in both of those buckets for the certified bilingual and the certified educators. So I hope I didn't confuse everyone.
No.
Okay.
Any questions?
Because, this is Bob. What's the difference between how does this change what is currently going on?
So currently, as they explained in their summary, I'll get back over to that. I think what they're trying to do is eliminate some of the coursework and testing requirements that are expensive and time consuming for these candidates. So currently, again, the eligibility for the second bilingual certification requires coursework for a specific content area, which we're still doing, as well as the coursework and testing. So I think what they're doing is for the folks who are already bilingual, you're no longer having to take that additional test. I think what it's doing is it's removing some burdensome course and test taking requirements, as long as you're meeting the 15 hours of credits for the one, and then the 15 hours of credit and the required coursework and testing for the other. So I think, again, it's just one more step to try and help with the shortage area that we have here for bilingual and the need for more bilingual teachers.
I think it will also help general ed teachers who might be thinking of getting a cross endorsement or another degree in bilingual education. I think this could also help them as well, couldn't it, Laura?
I think that's what it is. Yeah, that's the second bucket.
Yeah, and that's important. We have a lot of teachers that work with bilingual students all over the state that are not bilingual teachers, but would like to. But it's quite extensive, the testing and coursework and so forth. So that's another areas too. Questions on that? Okay, is that it for certification?
That's it for that certification proposal.
Okay.
But then we do have one more that is from the certification department that was just put in as a separate proposal because it didn't deal with the bilingual. So this one deals with the resident educator certificate, which I was unfamiliar with before this proposal came through. So the educator resident certificate is a pathway into the profession for aspiring educators, where under the supervision and mentorship of a veteran certified educator.
I think this proposal has been, or maybe it's been discussed before, and they were worried about the piece, how you said at the beginning, that referred to not evaluated, I forgot what word you used, but it came down to evaluated by a senior mentor teacher.
Right.
And that's what worries some. And I think as long as, and legislators, I'm sure, will question that too, especially those who were around when we put in our evaluation program in Connecticut, is it doesn't eliminate them. Any teacher can become, a subject of evaluation at any time. It doesn't matter, new, old, in the system for 40 years could also enter that and any evaluation plan across our state. So I think that's important to remember.
This is Woody. Is this just for alternate route people and master's people, not undergraduates?
Not undergraduates.
Not undergraduates.
So they can be either in an alternate route program or working on their master's in education.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Any further questions? Okay,
right.
Laura? Oh, Bob, did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess it only apply to alternate route or masters, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, as it's currently written, it's only alternate route to certification programs. So what we're adding is the language that says post-bachelor programs leading to certification that are approved by the State Board of Education. And that meet the guidelines established by the Every Student Succeeds Act. So it's expanding it from only ARCs to the other group as well.
Thanks.
Okay, Laura, next.
All right, so that concludes the certification section. Next, we're coming up on 3 proposals from Legal Affairs. So I'm glad Jess is here so she can correct anything that I say incorrectly. The first one is an act concerning technical changes to laws requiring fingerprinting in schools. So state law mandates that school employees have national criminal history record checks, which require access to the FBI database. And the FBI database requires that state statutes that mandate background checks for employees list 2 buckets, one being governmental and one being non-governmental entities, to have them listed out separately. The FBI also classifies charter school governing boards and charter cooperative arrangements as non-public. So what this is doing is, in this statute, it is removing those from the government public list and putting them in the non-government non-public list. Did I get that right, Jessa?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we don't think it should change anything about the functional approach to this. It's just that the federal government has, taken exception to the way that it was written. So we were trying to just make it consistent with what it is that they're looking for in order to have access to that FBI information.
That one's pretty straightforward, I think.
Any questions at all on that?
All right, then moving on to the next one. And this is where I get confused because they kind of seem to have something to do with each other, but they actually don't. So the next one is an act concerning revisions to the laws regarding charter school background checks. So this proposal changes the way that criminal background checks are conducted on charter school governing council members and members of charter management organizations. The Connecticut Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection, or DES, has indicated that based on FBI protocols, the checks are unable to be implemented as they're currently written in statute. So what all that means is that this is being proposed as a result of input from both DES and the FBI, and it pertains to, as I said, the background checks for specifically charter school governing council members and charter management organizations. This does not have an effect on the background checks that are done for teachers at charter schools. So those 2 specific entities are still going to be required to conduct background checks, but they just won't be the FBI checks. Jessa, did I get that one right?
Yeah, so admittedly, I'm with you that I get confused a little bit too, but yes, that we essentially have been taking the position that we would accept vendor checks, which are still background check, but slightly different because we were not able to process these consistent with that statutory language.
What does that mean, really? Is it not as extensive as the FBI?
So, I mean, it may depend on what vendor is used. Yes, it would mean that it's potentially a little less expansive than the FBI, which is really, sort of the gold standard. But from a practical perspective, that's actually been the case. That is what is happening now, because already we have not been able to conduct these. They have not been able to conduct these checks consistent with that FBI check because of the willingness of the FBI to run the checks. So we've taken the position that since it's impossible, they've had to use these vendor checks, which again can continue with a national, criminal history check. They do include a DCF check, but they're just not quite as expansive as that FBI fingerprinting check.
I know, Jessa, when we've had some grants at UConn that we've had to do, that we've had to go the vendor route versus the straight up FBI, and again, we find them to be equally as valuable and good, but it's it's something about how the question is asked and how the information is kept, and so when it's kept with a vendor, that just allows us to move in the process a little bit quicker.
Yeah. And I think, Bonnie, that had a lot to do with not just personnel, but like what you said, grants that are time sensitive. They weren't getting in that check that they needed, and they lost the grant because of it. So I think that's a piece, too, that's in there. I don't think it is any less of a check. It's certainly better as far as time goes, though.
Yeah, it's certainly not our intent to propose that there would be any access to our students or to our schools from folks who are not thoroughly background checked.
Right.
Does the vendor have to be approved?
Well, they're certified in some way, right, Jessa? The vendors, I would imagine.
I actually don't know the answer to that question, so I'll have to get back to you. But again, they're the ones that I'm familiar with, as you've indicated, Bonnie, are quite thorough. And again, it does still include a criminal history check, the requirement for a criminal history check, and the requirement for a DCF check, which are the areas where we would be most concerned. So there is a minimum standard there as to the expectations.
Yeah, and then they go through a whole list of things that they have to do to be in procurement for the state system. And so again, there's that check and balance in the procurement system as well, at least on our side.
Okay, Laura, next.
Okay. So moving on, and this is our last proposal from the legal department. It's an act concerning the recovery of misused state funds. Some of you are very familiar with why this is being proposed. This is recommended, it's being proposed as a result of recommendations from the auditors of public accounts as a direct result of what happened with Path Academy that many of you remember. The proposal here would allow the department to institute a civil action against any person, firm, corporation, business, or charter management organization that we believe or have reason to believe misuse state funds. And then it would allow, it's not a mandatory, it would allow the Attorney General to pursue the matter further if they deem it appropriate. So this would just be in an effort to recover misused state funds.
Questions?
Good idea.
Okay. Great. All right. So moving on to the next proposal. This one is an act concerning the Technical Education and Career System Superintendent. This is a resubmission from last year. You all, it came through the committee and the board, and then obviously got caught up in the end of session due to COVID. So this clears up, it's very simple and technical. It clears up a conflict in statute regarding the appointment of the CTEX superintendent. Right now, there are just two separate methods that are outlined in statute. So this is clarifying that until July 1 of 2023, which this is supposed to be in line with when the technical high schools are breaking or statutorily designed to break away from the department, until that time, the technical school board will recommend to the commissioner to accept or reject a candidate for superintendent. But after the time of July 1, 2023, when the systems are scheduled to break, the CTEX board will make its recommendation to the new executive director of the technical high school system for that executive director to ultimately have the final say in who the next superintendent will be. Did I get that right, Bob?
Yes, correct. I thought it was 2022, but that's okay.
It's 2023. It's the supplemental statutes haven't been codified yet. So I think that's what's been happening. People are looking up the statute and you have to actually go to the supplementals to see the ones that aren't haven't been codified in statute yet. But I looked at the supplemental this morning and it says 2023.
In June of 23?
July 1 of 2023.
Well, to be clear, though, that's not when the separation is happening, correct? It's just when this goes into effect, this shift.
That's when, is it not? I thought they were aligned. That's not true?
My understanding was that they were purposefully not aligned because it didn't make sense for the executive director to start the same day and then also recommend the superintendent the same day. So I think that there was a year lag, so the executive director could start and then be the person who steps in.
Oh, I think you're right. Yes. So this is just pertaining to when this happens. Right. Yes. Okay. Yep. You're right. Yep.
I think the reasoning on that, at least before, was that you want some continuity with the superintendent. You don't want the superintendent being kicked out the immediate time that the thing changes. So
right. It provides for a phase
in. To know each other.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, Laura.
Okay, so the next one also pertains to the technical education and career system, and it's an act concerning the provision of special education services at the technical high schools. Some of you may be familiar with this topic. It's never been something that we've brought through the board, but it has come up for the last several years. And the Department of Justice's Office of Civil Rights, along with many special ed advocates and legislators, have wanted to remove 10-76Q subsection C from the statutes for several years. Currently, that subsection allows the technical high schools to make a determination that they cannot accommodate the needs of a special education student, the needs that are outlined in their IEP, and therefore allows them to send them back to their home district after the student has already been enrolled in the system. So what this is doing is it is removing that subsection C and it's replacing it with a new subsection. So what this would do, and we think this is far more appropriate, is it would require there to be a transition, if you will, or a meeting prior to the student actually being enrolled in the technical system. So the local or regional board of education would need to call a PPT to go through and assess the child's needs. And they are required to invite the appropriate person from the technical high school in which the student is seeking enrollment to participate in that PPT. And we believe that it is far more appropriate to have that determination, or for the technical high schools to make their case on the front end, as opposed to having the student enrolled and then having their education disrupted if a decision is then subsequently made that the system can no longer support the needs of that child. Every other district in the state of Connecticut has to absorb the costs of special education children when they come into their system, and they have to try and figure it out. And we believe that that's an appropriate approach here.
Questions?
Yeah, I can talk to it briefly. I mean, it's one of the things that the system has been trying to make good progress in, because they've had the number of kids who have been rejected for admission, as opposed because of some of the needs have gone down. I think the we're pretty much in line with the state right now. With I think the last group of ninth graders that came in, 16.7% were special ed kids, and the state is like 15.99. So we still have a ways to go with that. The number of kids who were in the program that do have special needs has gone up by 41% over the last 2 years. The concern that that I have, and that is that there are kids who are going to either present, and it doesn't say in this legislation that it doesn't say in the proposed legislation that they don't get in. It just says they're going to have the discussion about that particular child. If the child needs an out of district placement, as opposed to, we want to send this child here from this particular district, and they need an out of district placement. In other words, we've got to put them into a residential program or a day another program that's not being provided by the technical high school system. That's where the rub is, and that's what happens with a lot of the local districts too. They have kids they can't accommodate, and they have to be placed in a special district, a special circumstance where the district's on the hook for that. So just because a kid applies and we go through that and say, well, they're going to need a residential placement. It's not really something we can do. And a lot of the choice programs actually, we're absorbing all this other costs, and it's cost us quite a bit to put the special ed stuff in place, and that's fine. But like the charter schools, the district the home district pays for all that. So my only concern is that there should be some way in which, if the child really requires a residential treatment or a day program that's totally outside of the technical high schools, that the cost of that shouldn't have to be borne by the technical high school system.
Any other comments or questions? I understand, your view, Bob, and I know this has been something that's gone on in a long time, and I know the technical schools have made great ways about increasing their special ed. But I do think this is necessary legislation to go in. I always thought it was odd that they had the right to do it anyways, that they could remove a child because they could not service the child, so to speak. Regular public schools certainly could never do that. And I think the best time to do this is at its transition time. A child is applying for the school, that the proper personnel is involved in the placement of the child. Because even like a residential program, Bob, that could happen after the child is enrolled in technical school. It could happen anytime. And I don't think that should be a reason why the child all of a sudden is removed from its present learning.
But the way this is worded, if they come in and there's a PPT or there's this meeting, and it says, well, the child needs a residential program, it doesn't say that the child can't come in. It says we have to take the child and put them in a residential program right from the beginning.
Is that how you read it, Laura? That it would be, is that any different than a child coming into a public school and having to go in, moving from New York and having to go into a residential program?
I don't personally see it as being any different. I don't know, Jessa, if you have anything that you can add. We've had a lot of conversations about this. One thing I will say, and then I'd like Jessa to jump in, is this is going to happen this year. There is a will among legislators to remove 10-76Q sub C. It's coming out. And so it can either come out with nothing in its place, or we can try and propose this that at least gets the technical high schools by statute a seat at the table on the front end. So that's all I would add.
Which I think is really important that that's an understanding and that they're involved. I mean, let's face it, any program or school should always be involved and have a seat at the table when these things happen. And that isn't necessarily the case as it stands now. We do have children that are simply removed from various school choice programs that we cannot service your child. And that, you know, we've even seen cases come in front of the board over the years of parents upset about that, you know, and feeling that their child should be serviced, that type of thing. So I do think it helps if the seat is at the table versus having it just done to us.
Yeah, I guess the other thing I'll say is we have opened up some stuff, so, you know, partial day programs for kids to come in from some of the districts to get some education, even though they're still in their home district. And we are in the district we've got the relationship with. They started to send us special ed kids that are not necessarily a good placement. We've taken them, but it's not. I mean, my concern is that this is just going to open up. Well, we got these kids. Let's make sure they get into the technical high school system, so they're off from our responsibility for their outside placement.
Yeah, I guess what I would add.
I know I know I'm not going to win this argument in the end, but I think it just needs to be put on the table that there has to be some funding for this at that point. You can't say, well, you got to spend you got to spend money on kids who have been pushed into the system.
I think just to reiterate what Laura said, I think that you know, we acknowledge that CTEX has made a lot of progress, and you know, I've been engaged with your teams on that, and we acknowledge that. I think that's good. We also acknowledge that there have been some missteps in perhaps the implementation, you know, historically the implementation of this law versus, you know, the sort of reality versus what the language says. I think Laura's point that providing for a seat at the table is really important. What it will allow is for that conversation to happen about the appropriateness of the CTEX before the student is, you know, transitioning. And, you know, I think related to the funding, of course, you know, frankly, we hear that from all districts and from all choice programs that, you know, funding, especially around special education, you know, is an issue. We know that the federal funding that was expected, you know, historically wasn't as robust as we would hope to support the services provided under the IDEA. In my conversations with your team on this question, one of the sort of resolutions we've come to is that if we need to go back and try to address that in the future, once we see that there's an issue, we certainly can have conversations about that. What you're describing, I think, is unfortunately sort of an abuse of the relationship or the system, and not necessarily about the language of the statute. So if we start seeing that as something that does need to be legislated to protect CTEX, then certainly we'd be happy to have those conversations and work with you on ensuring that it's not a situation where you feel as though schools are choosing CTEX as an opportunity for students when perhaps it's not best for the student themselves, because I think that's what's in all of our end goals, is to ensure that our students are getting access, and that they're getting access and being accommodated in a way that makes it a good and productive education placement for that individual student.
Yeah, I just think one of our first experiments, we've seen some abuse, and that's the problem. So so say they have the way this is written, you have this meeting, and you know say, well, it doesn't really appear that's a good placement for the child, based on, you know, one side or the other feels that way. What happens then?
Well, I think a PPT and an IEP is always an individualized determination as to what is most appropriate for that student. Mm-hmm. So I think it's difficult to answer that question because it's going to depend on the specific student. But certainly there would be the possibility, just like there is, or you know, it is always up to that PPT, what is the best placement, most appropriate placement for that student.
Right. And that PPT is one of the initial first meetings too, that sometimes goes beyond the student and present teachers. So I think that is important too, that PPT does involve a lot of other people, and sometimes for the first time. So I think that discussion is valuable when that happens, obviously.
But as I understand it, the PPT takes place before the student goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's
Before enrollment.
that the student will not go, as opposed to having a PPT after the student has already left.
Yeah, but it doesn't say the
It's
choice.
not the intent. It's not the intent of this language to, in any occasion, prevent a student who wants to go to CTEX to be able to have access to CTEX. I mean, the purpose of removing the language is, in fact, to prevent that from happening. However, I think we would acknowledge, and I think the federal government has acknowledged, in very rare circumstances, there may be a PPT where the parents and the student and the sending district and CTEX all agree that the placement is not best for the student. But that is certainly not the intent of this language, to have any sort of barrier to access.
Well, okay.
Malia?
So I'm trying to, I feel like I'm hearing two conversations here. That there's one around the language here, which seems to be who's involved and when in this conversation. Mm-hmm. And then there's a whole other issue of who bears the cost of services for that student, whether it's the sending district, whether it's CTEX, whether it's whatever the choice program may be. Are these separate conversations?
Yeah,
I think so.
Sort of.
Yeah. In this particular case, there's, I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I'm just curious, where is the legislation, or what is the legislation around who actually bears the cost?
The cost would be borne by whatever entity is responsible for providing the free and appropriate public education for the student, whether that be the LEA or the technical high school.
Basically, in this case,
so I know we're talking about these two things, but there are other choice programs, right? So is it the same across all of those, right? So do magnet schools, it's the sending district, correct, that actually bears the cost of that? Yes. So to Bob's point, why is it that we have, and indeed, that's a separate conversation from this legislation, but is there a need for a different conversation around the equitable funding, another equitable funding conversation related to choice and how those costs are actually borne, right? Because I'm at this moment, I completely understand Bob's perspective on why is it that CTEX are needing to bear that cost, but no other choice program has to bear that cost. It's the sending district. You live in that district. That district is responsible for you and your education. So I don't want to conflate the conversation. I'm just trying to say, it seems to me like there's a different issue to be hashed out that actually isn't what's being presented to us right now.
You're correct, Malia. It is two different issues. It's very much our school choice issue that we've been having. This falls in that. But I think they are two different things as far as the funding. There are fees that are associated with some of our other, choice schools, too, whether it's the sending district, accepting district. But they are two different things. And unfortunately, the other one that we've been grappling with for almost 2 years now is the more difficult one, and that's the one that's to deal with funding.
We probably could call Kathy back in to talk about it. I mean, I think the answer to that is in part that the funding that CTEX receives is also different than other choice programs. So it's not drawing specific parallels doesn't necessarily work because of the complexity of what types of funding are provided to the different types of choice programs.
Right. It's similar, like magnet schools have certain kind of funding and their rules. You can't really compare all the rules, but there are difficulties with all of them, actually. I mean, even our magnet schools have difficulties with these things too. That's why you see we have two of them closing and districts are taking them back or taking them over just, recently. So, but to address your original question, Malia, yes, I do think that there are two different things here. It's this proposal and then the whole umbrella of the funding of all these choice schools.
I guess just to clarify, in most of the choice programs, the cost of special education is charged back to the local district. Whether they're not just an outplacement, but the special education cost of taking care of that child in the charter school or other kind of choice programs. We're not saying, I'm not advocating that they cover all the costs. That'd be nice, but that's not, that's not what this is about. It's about paying for, out of district placement, which just kind of, my concern is it just opens up an avenue for folks to be able to get rid of the very expensive out of district placements.
Anybody else?
I was just going to say at the end, ultimately, the spirit of this proposal is to make it so any child who wants to have an education through the technical education and career system has that opportunity.
There are going to be some kids who just won't. If we have to outplace them, they're not going to get the career tech.
Right.
Hopefully that doesn't happen it doesn't happen very often, I'm sure, but it there ought to be some, you shouldn't have, just trying to prepare for the unexpected or for the kind of expected. But
Malia, did you have something else or? Well, just saw your mic fell back on.
Just saying, a note to sort of something else to add to the list of the how to address or where to address sort of the different ways things are funded and how that happens.
Yeah. Okay, back to you, Laura.
Okay, so we're on to our last proposal. This one has 4 different proposals in it. These are all resubmissions. These all went through the board last year, and again, they were caught up in the session that never happened. So the first one, and these are all basically removing obsolete or duplicative requirements in statute. So the first one removes statutory language regarding what was called an academic advancement program that specifically kind of outlined the ways in which mastery could be shown for 11th and 12th graders. And in 2013, legislation allowing local boards of ed to determine eligible credits based on the demonstration of mastery was done, which made this statute irrelevant. So we're just seeking to strike it from the statutes.
Any question on that? Okay, again, resubmittal. This second section removes obsolete statutory language that regards continuing education classes. So also in 2013, busy year, legislation was passed that no longer requires districts to report all of their professional learning offered for the purposes of tracking continuing education to the department, but it did not take out the department's requirement to collect the data. So they don't have to report it, but we still have to collect it in the statutes. And so what we're doing to meet that statutory obligation now is we're sending a survey out to districts, and it's just self-reporting. It's the data that we're collecting. It's not reliable. Whoever sends it, and then nothing gets done with it. And so we would just like to remove the collecting requirement.
So why are we doing it?
Statute's telling us we have to do it still.
The statute says we have to do, but you must remember, Don, CEUs and what we had to do as teachers to submit all that. And you always wondered, like, what black hole does this all go into? And people celebrated when they got audited, like, because they were like, someone actually is listening to us out there. So it was a welcome withdrawal, and now we should withdraw it from the agency as well.
Yep. Okay.
A lot of work.
Okay, so the next one I think you're all familiar with also, and it just removes obsolete statutory language regarding CERC and a reporting requirement that is still in statute and obligation of the department, and it stemmed from a time before CERC became a quasi-public agency that is now subject to the AP, the Auditors of Public Accounts. It's subject to all of the state contracting language, and it produces its own reports about its finances. Those are also available on, I think, Open Data CT, and some of it is available on the department's website as well. So it's just not something that should be statutorily a requirement for the department to then produce an independent report on all of those contracts and expenditures.
Any questions on all those? Those were pretty straightforward from our last year.
And there's just one more. Yep, just one more, and then I'm done. So the last one, again, it's removing duplicative reporting requirements for a report that's a requirement of the department. We collect financial data and student data, which is now available on EdSite. And when these reporting requirements were originally made, EdSite did not exist, nor did the education financial system that was, I think, propped up now 2 years ago. And so now that both of those entities exist on our website and the information is publicly available, we've never produced this report, by the way, but now we would like the requirement to be taken out of statute completely. So I think that sums that one up. And there are a few things that regarding geography and cost of living indicators that are required. That's just not data that we collect anyway. And that's it.
Okay. Any questions? If there are none, I would need a motion to accept these proposals to bring to the full board in December, correct, Laura? December?
Yes. Yep.
Yes.
So moved.
Second.
Second,
Any discussion? Any further discussion? All in favor? You could just,
aye.
thanks so
Thank you
much.
all. Thank you.
I know we've hit our hour time, and I did say at the last board meeting that if we had time, we might address our statement. Laura, if you could just update them with the information you shared with me about, in particular, this, Malia, had a lot to do with your comment about where is this going with the legislation. If she could just update with us, and then we can decide what we want to do with it at our next meeting.
Sure. So when the discussion was happening at the last meeting, I happened to recall that we've gone down this road before. And so I went back and did some research through my files and through board materials from actually 2016. And at a board meeting in December of 2016, I presented the legislative proposals to you along with a resolution concerning school choice that was heavily influenced at the time by Bill Davenport and brought through and Bonnie and brought through the Legislation and Policy Development Committee where we crafted it and then brought it to the full board. It was sent to the legislature. I found the transmission of my sending it to the legislature in January of 2017 for their consideration, and nothing ever came of it. And so I think this board needs to make a decision about whether or not you want to go through that process again, because I don't know whether or not you're going to see a different result or if we should try and take a different approach. I know none of us have the answers, but I try, a rule of thumb for me is never to bring my boss a problem that I don't have a potential solution for. And so I don't know whether or not we as a body can sit and brainstorm and try and think of, because ultimately the question is there's a finite amount of money for education in the state of Connecticut. And we have multiple systems that have been propped up over 20, 30 years that are funded differently. And a lot of it makes no sense, but it's a product of the beast of the legislative process and these different things coming through at different times. So do we want to try and tackle the problem where we're not only sending over this, here's the problem, or do we want to try and say, here's a possible solution to the problem. So I just wanted to put that out for consideration.
And of course, the possible solution is funding. And as you know, increasing funding someplace else would mean that we would, as a board, would have to decrease it somewhere else or encourage the legislation just to come up with money that they're going to claim they don't have. So I think it's something to keep in mind as we're moving forward. I know, Laura, you had said that you would certainly, when you meet with legislation, that you would mention that this has come up as a discussion again, that it is almost 4 years old, that it was submitted 4 years ago, and that is still a great concern, knowing full well this board knows that it's also a huge funding issue, and to push for something that is not budgeted by the governor via the department might be some area that maybe we don't want to get into.
You know, I certainly understand the issues around fiscal notes and the fact that at this point in the state budget, it's like anything with a fiscal note is like, you know, it ain't going to happen. But I think that if we're really going to be committed to inclusion and equity in terms of what school choice means, then we have to get serious about it. We can't do what's easy. We need to do what's right. And so I do hope that there's a very serious discussion about this, because we do need to start to find an equitable platform for all of these choice programs. The fact that they're each funded a different way for whatever reason, and why the legislature chooses to do that in a different manner, I never question the wisdom or anything regarding a decision that they ultimately make. I think I said that right. But I think that at the end of the day, we owe it to ourselves. If we're gonna talk about these things, then we need to follow up with it, not just say, okay, here's what we think, and you can do with it what you want. That just doesn't wash for me. Yeah. Are we committed or are we not?
And I agree with you, Bonnie, completely. And we had a lot of these conversations, in particular when we were making our 5-year plan, and the piece on equity, because a lot of us felt that is something we really have to go down that path. And unfortunately, we really have made no leeway at all on it. And we do say that there's school choice and equity in school choice. And it's a tough struggle, because as we know, it's not school choice if there's too many barriers and obstacles in the way of preventing these children from having school choice. So I'm not looking for an answer here, but it's something to think about on how we want to proceed with this. Do we want to proceed with it through this committee and bringing something to the full board, our thoughts, through the 5-year plan when we get it started, which I'm assuming Jessa is, I don't know if you're involved in that. It has got to be just around the corner, I'm guessing, because our present one is done in June. Malia, you had a comment or a question?
I do, and there's probably a couple of both of those in there. So, I think it's interesting that I don't think that we've really landed very firmly in our conversations about what exactly we mean when we say equity. I hear that sometimes I'm wondering if we're talking about equity for student outcomes, if we're talking about addressing the inequitable outcomes by race and income of our students. Are we talking about equity as it relates to funding of the various choice programs? So I lay that out there and just saying I don't think that we've been clear actually about what we really mean in that. And I think as we make a decision about how we move forward, we need to be really clear about what we mean. I think we need to have a better problem statement about what we're trying to solve. It's not that I don't think that there should be, as a parent, as a consumer of the public education system in Connecticut, the system, so to speak, that we have for all of this funding is incredibly confusing. It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem it certainly just doesn't make sense to parents. But and I absolutely want. I'm a big proponent of things making sense. To be clear, but and I'll stop in just a moment. But I just think that we have confused that that we have used the word in various ways, and we really need to keep in mind what's the outcome, what are the outcomes that we are seeking to achieve, and then what are the various policies that we need to be dealing with in order to get to those outcomes. And if we still feel like this is one of those key areas that we need to pursue in order to get to the outcomes, in my mind, to have more equitable outcomes for our students of color and our low-income students in this state, then let's go forth. But at the moment, I feel like I don't necessarily have a very clear through line as to the relationship.
John?
If I could, and probably to help Jessa as she begins her preliminary work on the next 5-year plan, equity by itself is kind of missing. If we created at CABE a committee about 4 years ago. It's basically, we call it now diversity, equity, and inclusion. And equity by itself is kind of missing those other two pieces. And even down in DC at NSBA, that's what they talk about: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think you need all three words to begin to have healthy conversations, which in my mind have been having for my 53 years as an educator, and we're still having the same same doggone conversations going on today. But it's time to come up with some suggestions, and let's kind of move forward. I'm tired of talking. I really am.
Yeah. I think, I'm not going to speak for all of you, but I think what we're probably looking at now is to incorporate this into our 5-year plan and to have the discussions go as a full board versus our committee trying to come up with a statement or a resolve that's almost going to be impossible to bring to the full board just to have the same conversation all over again. So I think our best move at this point would be to have very much what it was slated for, to be on and be part of the 5-year plan already. But I think that's probably our best solution. Laura, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of a way to move forward. And just so you know, the work is starting to happen to get us geared up for the next 5-year plan. I had drafted a contract. We're in the process of trying to find a person to help facilitate as happened last time around. And I've actually just handed the project off to Keith Norton in our office. So he is going to be taking department lead because as we go into the legislative session, I just wasn't going to be able to focus on it the way it needed to be focused on. So Keith Norton is heading up that project for the department.
And one thing to note, Laura, that I know we discussed, in addition to the fact that we plan on providing some additional updates in this meeting, one of the things we are anticipating as part of the process will be to kind of take stock of where we are based on last year's plan so that we're prepared to move forward with this next plan and ensure that we're not creating redundancies or perhaps focusing where we feel like we needed to have more focus. Based on our experience with the past 5 years.
Okay. Anything else from any committee members before we call it a day? It was good to see you all. Have a great Thanksgiving. Stay safe. And we'll see you all in December.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Jessa.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.